Welcome to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. WikiBacklash, what is now called Cablegate or Red Facegate, has many asking who benefits from disclosure of classified government documents. Do such leaks serve the public interest at the expense of diplomacy? And will governments become even more closed to public scrutiny as a result? To discuss WikiLeaks, I'm joined by Karn Ross in Boston. He is the founder and executive director of Independent Diplomat. And in Dusseldorf, we go to Annie Machon. She is a former intelligence officer for MI5 and now an author and journalist. And another member of our CrossTalk team, Yelena Hanga. All right, Annie, if I can go first to you, since you're a former spook and we have a former diplomat on the program, would you say that WikiLeaks is doing a good job? Because it seems like they've created an enormous amount of attention for themselves, and it doesn't seem there's no end in sight at all, okay? We have tens of thousands of more documents that are supposed to come out, and even more after that. And it's really rattled the cage of governments all around the world. So would you say they're doing a good job, doing the right thing?
Absolutely. I think that as concerned citizens around the world, of course we need to know what's being done in our name. And we've had, over the last few years, governments lying to take us into illegal wars, to cover up their complicity in issues like torture. They've covered up war crimes. And but for whistleblowers, we would never know what was going on. And I think, one, it's useful to be able to hold the governments to account to a certain degree as citizens, but two, it also enables the victims sometimes to try and claim some sort of justice for those actions. So, for example, one of the big WikiLeaks stories earlier this year was of the Apache helicopter shootout in Afghanistan, where 2 Reuters journalists were killed. And the Reuters families have been pushing for years to get information out of the Pentagon about this. The Pentagon just lied barefacedly about it. So, of course, now we have WikiLeaks showing them the video, and now they can try and push for some sort of justice. So on a number of levels, I think they're doing a very important job.
Karn, what do you think? I mean, has it gone too far? I mean, does it limit the ability of governments to conduct diplomacy now? Because a lot of these leaks, and when we look at them, and some of them are just really embarrassing, okay? And the ones that I looked at to deal with the post-Soviet space, for example, just shows a lack of really, I think, professional ability to look at events on the ground, to the point where we have a leak where the State Department, under Hillary Clinton, ordered employees to spy at the United Nations, spy on other diplomats. So there's a real range here. How much is this impacted? And I don't want to qualify it positive or negative about how to do diplomacy in the world today.
Well, I think you're right not to qualify it as positive and negative, because it's probably going to be both. I don't think WikiLeaks can know with any certainty that it won't be negative, but equally I don't think the US government can know with certainty that it definitely will be negative. There's such an extraordinary amount of data, so many thousands of telegrams, which are, many of them, extremely sensitive. I don't buy the argument that some have said that this just confirms stuff we knew before. There's a lot of new material here, much of which is extremely embarrassing. I think there will be certainly some effects on diplomacy of this. In the short term, I think governments will restrict the circulation of data, will tighten the circle of who sees sensitive information. But in order to be effective, governments have got to share information, so that tension is unresolvable for governments. In the longer run, what I hope will happen is that governments will realise that what WikiLeaks has done means that they can no longer assume that any data they keep will ultimately be kept secret and won't appear on the internet. And what I hope that will do is pressure them to make sure that what they're saying in private, what they're doing in private, is the same as what they're saying about it in public. And if that is indeed is the effect, that would ultimately be a positive thing. But of course we can't really know that at this stage.
Annie, I mean, it's interesting here, the whole discussion, and all of us have been watching this very closely. You can't avoid it right now. But it's all about information control. But I haven't seen too many people say, maybe these governments should just stop doing these bad things, and then there won't be any leaks because there won't be, you know what I mean? I mean, it's like, you know, it's not trying to change your behavior. It's just the perception of your behavior. That's what everybody seems to be worried about, especially Western governments. You know, some of the terrible things, forced regime change, lying to the media, manipulating the media. I mean, I think this is why so many people in the public sphere is interested in WikiLeaks, because Western mainstream media has failed awfully in telling people what's actually going on in the world.
No, I totally agree. I mean, our mainstream media, the established old-fashioned media, has been much too controlled and much too craven over the last few years to hold our governments to account. So, of course, that means we've gone into situations where our governments could lie to take us into the war in Iraq, for example, the notorious 45 minutes from doom headlines. And yet none of the newspapers at the time were doing their job. So WikiLeaks is effectively doing the job that the mainstream media should be doing. I mean, everyone says, oh, it's a whistleblower site. It's a site which provides channels for whistleblowers to securely leak information. I suppose what they're doing is a sort of journalistic role. And I think the fact that Julian has the capability and the rest of his team have the capability to protect the identities of those whistleblowers so they can go public with their concerns without risking their careers and imprisonment and liberty, as I said, is very important. And it's a shame that the rest of the mainstream media is not doing that job to this day.
You know, Karin, if I can go to you, one of the criticism of WikiLeaks is that its purpose is to show transparency of government behavior around the world. In the case right now, that all of these diplomatic cables from the U.S. State Department. But a lot of people, its critics would say, it in itself is not a transparent organization. So, I mean, how do you know what is being leaked? Are they selecting it? There are people that will say that WikiLeaks is obsessed with the United States and its behavior in the world, and which, you know, I'm not going to say is a bad thing, but nonetheless, I mean, it is not an agenda-less organization. It has its own agenda. It has the ability to give us information that it wants us to see. Is that a concern of yours?
Well, I think these are fair criticisms that WikiLeaks have got to answer, and I think they would say that actually they're not particularly focused on the US. They've released data about other countries. It just happens that the leaks have mostly been about the US. But I think they need to be careful that they're not seen as being an anti-American organization. But I think there is a category error in claiming that the standards that apply to government should also apply to WikiLeaks. I mean, governments are bodies of extraordinary power. They can wage war, imprison people, do good things, and sometimes very bad things. And I think the standards of accountability and transparency are really very different that need to be applied to government than applied to an organization like WikiLeaks, which after all is not killing people, not waging war. It is basically a much more minor phenomenon. Equally, though, as I've said, I think there are ethical standards that WikiLeaks needs to be careful to maintain.
What if you think about that, Annie? I mean, they put themselves in a position where they are an authority now in the public sphere, and so they have the ability to put out what they want and what they don't want to do. Someone pointed out to me and said, where is the WikiLeaks on Israel, for example? I mean, isn't there any issues there? It seems like every other country in the world has been affected by this, and maybe it will come out in the future. But again, they can control a lot. I mean, someone can give them information, but it's up to WikiLeaks to decide if they're going to give it to the public sphere.
Well, I think if you look back over their record over the last few years, I mean, they have been going since 2007. So even before the big info dumps that have happened this year, they have been pretty even-handed and quite Catholic, really, about the sort of information they've been releasing about governments, intelligence agencies, and mega corporations around the world. So now, of course, the focus is very much on them because of the American aspect. But, you know, they will release whatever is credible in their view. And put it out in public from whatever source they get. I mean, they seem to be on a mission to say, well, we don't like cover-ups, we don't like criminality, we want to shine a light in the dark corners of government and big corporations. And we feel we're doing a duty in doing that. So, you know, what else can you do? I think in terms of holding them to the same standards as Khan was saying, as governments, is of course unnecessary. And I heard recently that the Pentagon now has a 120-strong team investigating WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. So I think in terms of, if you've got a team like that after you, then you're not going to be that open and that out there and that transparent. You are going to take some protective measures.
Protective measures, I think that's very interesting. I'd like to ask both of you, given the magnitude of documents that are coming out, how in the world did the U.S. State Department miss somebody downloading so much material? I mean, the sheer volume of it, the amount of time it would take. And I'm not looking for a conspiracy here, maybe just really bad management. Karin, what do you think about that? I mean, just the girth of the whole thing. I mean, it takes a long time even to read it all.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I mean, I just can't understand how one person or a small group of people could be downloading so much information without a red light going off.
I rather agree, and I think there's much more to come out on this story. I find it basically implausible, this account that one army private downloaded this enormous stock of telegrams, some of them dating back to 1966. And there seems to be a kind of witch hunt about this man in America right now, that this man should, some have called for his execution, rather belying the principle of innocence until proven guilty. But at the same time, coming from the British Foreign Service, I was amazed that so many documents were available online on a computer. In the UK system, sensitive telegrams of that kind go to a much, much smaller circle of people. It's not to say the UK is impenetrable, and perhaps one day it will suffer its own WikiLeaks of its own. But I was rather amazed, like you, about the scale of this and how on earth did this happen.
Annie, what do you think about that? I mean, is it, again, not going into the realm of conspiracy thinking and all that, but I mean, one person, do you think more people were involved in this? Or they don't want to say more people were involved because they don't want to show how lax their security is? I mean, they want to look for a fall guy, maybe this guy was involved in it, just wrap him around in it, and then, we say, we found the guy.
I think probably that is very much the case, that there is a fall guy and that's it. And it's very much to spare their blushes as well. But I have to say, having worked on the inside, the security around a lot of the databases that governments use in the West tends to be pretty lax and pretty sort of retro. They don't tend, or certainly weren't focusing until very recently, on good tech backups. So I think it's really their chickens coming home to roost because they didn't take these sort of threats seriously enough. And it's interesting as well that sort of hacktivist circles now seem to be able to run rings around the NSA, the Pentagon, all these military types. And it's almost a sort of David and Goliath sort of approach where an organisation like WikiLeaks can level the playing field for whistleblowers, where they can, take a hit at the big organisations, the big government, and their lies. And I think it sort of resonates with a lot of people.
I'm going to jump in.
Sort of I'm going
to jump in right real quick here. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on WikiLeaks. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about WikiLeaks activities. But before, let's see what Russians think about public databases.
Documents revealed. WikiLeaks, called one of the largest leaks of classified information in history, continues to publish more and more classified documents. WikiLeaks might be called unprecedented, leaking an incredible number of documents. In Russia, the Ministry of the Defense launched an electronic database presenting documents from military archives. According to the polls, the launch of the project was supported by 90% of the citizens, while only 10% opposed the idea. Thus, information related to the war's operations, heroic feats, and rewards of Soviet soldiers now is open to the public. Peter?
Okay, I'd like to go back to you, Annie. One of the interesting things that we've been hearing a lot about how to deal with WikiLeaks, and I'd like to go to a soundbite from Joe Lieberman, the U.S. Senator from Connecticut, and what he thinks the U.S. government should do with WikiLeaks. Let's give him a hear.
Well, in my opinion, what WikiLeaks has done amounts to espionage in a most serious form. It's probably the single greatest act and most terrible act of espionage against the United States in our history, because WikiLeaks used the massive power and openness of the Internet to disseminate stolen classified information around the world. And in doing so, compromised not only America's national security, but the security of a lot of other countries and the lives of a lot of people who are mentioned in those documents.
Okay, Annie, it's quite interesting here what Joe Lieberman has to say. He doesn't want to deal with any of the information that are in those cables, okay, at all. I mean, it's complete, I see that as complete denial, okay? Almost to the point he's saying, okay, it's all true, but, okay, because that's what it looks like to me. Is that what it looks like to you? Because there seems to be very little coming out of the State Department, out of the U.S., about the authenticity of it. They actually even don't really doubt the authenticity, do they? I mean, because they say, well, on that I won't talk about that issue, I won't talk about that issue. So, I mean, this is kind of a state of denial. We just have to make sure we can't have whistleblowers. That's the most important thing, protect national security, irrespective of content.
Well, whether it's national security or national embarrassment is another matter. But yes, this is a classic response, that you shoot the messenger and you don't address the message. I mean, I certainly lived through that in the whistleblowing years back in the 1990s in the UK. And I've seen that time and time again as well with subsequent whistleblowers, that if you can discredit and destroy the organisations or the people involved, then you don't have to address the very serious message that they're putting out. And the pushback from some of these American politicians that they should assassinate Assange,
Yes,
or that they should put WikiLeaks on a foreign terrorist list, as well as try and perhaps prosecute them for espionage and things like that. I mean, that's just ludicrous. You know, who is the criminal here? Is it the person? Is it the organisation? Is it the government that is committing the crimes? Or is it the person who is reporting those crimes?
Karen, it's really interesting with the Lieberman piece, because it seems to me when I looked at it, I was just aghast, saying, you can't interrogate us. You can't ask us any questions. You have no right to know, because we'll protect you. It's our job to protect you. And I think that's quite insulting to a public looking at these documents, because I think there is huge interest in them. It's just that government isn't accountable to people, and that's what this organization is all about, irrespective of what you think of its founder or its behavior or maybe its charter. The documents that aren't refuted as being authentic speak for themselves, and government is not accountable.
Oh, I entirely agree. That's why WikiLeaks exists, because people feel that the government has not been telling them the truth over the last few years, particularly in Iraq, Afghanistan, the war on terror, and they're absolutely right. But the reaction here, both politically and publicly here in the US, has been pretty extraordinary. Basically, a mass condemnation of WikiLeaks, and politicians taking it in turns to condemn them in ever more colourful terms. And that's a very interesting thing. It seems to me to speak of the mood here since 9/11, where there are constant stories feeding national paranoia about terrorism, some with foundation. But it doesn't lead to a deeper questioning of the relationship between government and the people. And I hope on sober reflection people will question that relationship more fundamentally. I've been amazed here in the US that even liberal commentators have assumed and argued that government needs secrecy in order to operate, but they don't even know what government is keeping secret from us.
Yeah. How do we get around that, Annie? We do accept the fact that we have a diplomatic corps, we do have security forces. It is a dangerous world. You know, you're not paranoid by saying it's a dangerous world. I mean, but where's the line? Where do we draw where we need to be transparent while having secrets that are legitimate to have, and convince people that we know the difference between the two? Because I think there's, if you look at the politics going on in the U.S., it's basically mass hysteria, because nobody knows what really to believe anymore at all. And all of a sudden you have this organization like WikiLeaks that gives you an enormous amount of information. It's not filtered, or at least it doesn't appear to be filtered. And if you want to make the effort, you can actually learn a lot about how your government works.
Well, I agree with Khan. I think there's a breakdown of trust between people and government. They don't feel they've been told the truth. And I think in terms of sites like WikiLeaks and the role of whistleblowers, they need a certain degree of protection, because at the moment in our countries, whistleblowers tend to be prosecuted and persecuted. And there is no official channel for example, intelligence whistleblowers to go to in the UK and the US. So, I mean, it's well acknowledged within the intelligence agencies that the only information you need meaningfully to keep secret is sensitive operational techniques, ongoing operations, and agent identities. And anything else really, should be out there. So increased accountability, increased transparency will increase trust between the governed and the government. And if there is a proper official channel that whistleblowers can go to, where they feel they will be not only heard, but that their whistleblowing will be acted upon meaningfully, I think then probably we wouldn't need sites like WikiLeaks. But until that day, unfortunately, we do.
Karen, you're a former diplomat. What do you think about that? Are those good parameters?
Yes, I think they are good parameters, but I think these parameters should be elaborated basically by Parliament, by the democratic mechanisms of scrutiny and accountability. And I think that one of the reasons WikiLeaks has come about is because Parliament, both in Britain and Congress in the US, has basically failed to act as an adequate mechanism of accountability and scrutiny over the last few years. I know this. I worked on very sensitive issues, Iraq, Afghanistan, terrorism. I was never properly questioned by Parliament. either before or since, or during that period of policy making, or even subsequently. And I think there's a general sense that that mechanism is inadequate. A sensible conclusion from all of this, therefore, would be that parliaments, MPs, politicians need to ask themselves, how can they promote better mechanisms of transparency and accountability rooted in democratic institutions, rather than allowing WikiLeaks to do it in this very crude and dramatic fashion?
You know, I'd like to address one more issue with both of you that I think is very important. I mean, I don't know anybody that's read all of the cables, but I've read a lot of them. But the cable that got my attention the most, not the embarrassing ones, the funny ones, and there are plenty of them here, but it was the cable headed Reporting on Collection Needs, the United Nations, Ref State 048489. Now, that is a document, a cable that is quite significant, because that is a cable that went from the State Department out. Everything else, from what I can see, went from outside to the State Department. Now, I think it's quite interesting, it's quite galling that the U.S. State Department is demanding its own employees to break U.S. and international law. And both of you, I am very dissatisfied that mainstream media has not focused enough on this cable. Everyone goes after the funny ones, the embarrassing ones, and there's plenty of them. What politicians by definition can be embarrassing, I think, okay? But what about this? Again, this is more smoke and mirrors, and it's trying to change the topic. Annie, what do you think about that? Because it's very clear what State Department officials are supposed to do, their marching orders.
Absolutely. And again, it just shows that the mainstream media is not doing its job adequately, and that's why we need organisations like WikiLeaks. But it's interesting as well that the idea that the State Department could be ordering diplomats to spy on UN counterparts and things now is being released by WikiLeaks. This story, of course, broke as well in the UK and US way back in 2003 in the run-up to the Iraq War, where we had a very famous UK intelligence whistleblower, Catherine Gunn, who worked for GCHQ, which is the UK listening post, who got hold of a telegram that actually said that the US wanted certain swing states to be spied upon in the run-up to the crucial vote about the legality of the Iraq War. This woman, and this really highlights the value of what WikiLeaks is doing now, this woman was victimized for months. They charged her with a breach of the Official Secrets Act. She lost her job, she lost her income, she lost everything. And it was only at the very last hour before the trial started that they dropped her prosecution because of potential political embarrassment. So to put an individual through that for reporting crime and illegality on the part of the states within the UN is just ludicrous. So if WikiLeaks can report that sort of information without someone having to go for the chop, you know, or lose their job or get prosecuted for leaking that sort of information, I say all power to them.
You know, Karen, if I go back to you, are you concerned by this cable about the order for State Department officials to spy on their counterparts at the UN? That's not given enough airtime. It's not being talked enough about, because I know that the State Department spokesperson was asked about it, and just a convoluted answer. I read it over and over again. I couldn't figure out what the hell he was saying. Okay, I really don't. I mean, it came from outside.
Yes.
And that's this convoluted nonsense. Okay, he didn't want to answer the question. And like I said, out of a lot of the cables, that is one that is that's a huge indictment of what's going on in American foreign policy.
Well, yes and no. I have to say, I mean, firstly, that a lot of the media I've been aware of has picked up on that cable. I've been certainly asked a lot about it in interviews. Secondly, I'm rather less surprised and kind of agitated about it than some are, because the fact that states spy on each other and on the UN is, I'm afraid, no secret. I spent many years working at the UN for the UK, and it's widely understood there that there are many countries spying on each other and on the activities of the UN.
We've run out of time here. This is an ongoing story. I hope you'll come back and discuss more evidence of what WikiLeaks can actually do for the world. Many thanks to my guests today in Boston and in Dusseldorf. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk News.